Here's an episode of How to Analyse Poetry from the Learning Cauldron. Today we'll be looking at Norman MacCaig's poem Basking Shark. Analysing poetry involves identifying and dissecting the literary techniques that the poet uses effectively to explore the theme or themes of a poem. In his poem Basking Shark, MacCaig explores evolution, man's relationship with, place in, and attitude towards nature, and isolation. The title of the poem, Basking Shark, is the only time that the creature involved in this poem is actually mentioned by name, and therefore is useful in establishing the setting and the subject of the poem. It starts with an infinitive verb, to stub, immediately creating action, because this is the most basic form of any verb, and there's another to in the next line. So the idea of action is there straight from the beginning of the poem. And then the word or reinforces the setting, out at sea, that Basking Shark has already hinted at, and we have our first image. Now the interesting thing is that this is a short poem, as you can see, and yet it is packed with excellent imagery, so well worth remembering that when you have to write about imagery. The rock is reminding us that just as a rock is hard and solid and immovable, so too, when his oar hits it, is this giant sea creature. And if we notice here, B is the sound at the end of this first line, and then we have the same sound at the end of the next two, which tells us that this is a rhyming triplet. And in fact, this poem, unusually for MacCaig, is composed of 5 rhyming triplets. A lot of his poetry is free verse, and this is quite different. Moving on, we have an interesting word choice here with the word slounge. Some would say that's a neologism, although I've actually found it in a dictionary. But it's this idea of a slow, leisurely movement as it emerges from the deep. And you can imagine this would be quite a scary experience. Basking sharks are up to 10 metres long. So picture that. They are huge. And if you met that on your own out at sea, it would make you stop and think, as indeed it did MacCaig. And then there's a slight humour, a light-heartedness here, with the use of the parenthesis too often. It's a thing, he says, that happened once too often to me. And then he changes his mind as we go into the second stanza, and we can see that because of the word but, which signals a change in direction. He has said it once was too often, and now he's saying but not too often. And then he pauses again, as the dash shows us. Though enough, he says. I'm glad it happened, but only once. I wouldn't want it to happen again. And then he emphasises why he is glad it did happen that once through the word choice of gain. This implies something positive that has been a benefit in his life. And what has been a benefit? That once he met, almost implying it's like a person, on a sea tin-tacked with rain. This is a fabulous metaphor. If you imagine throwing drawing pins onto the surface of a puddle, for example, or a pond, and you can imagine the little round dimples they would make on the surface, and he's describing the falling of raindrops on the surface of the sea in those terms. It's a wonderful comparison. And then he speaks about the basking shark, and he uses a metaphor to describe it as well. Room-sized monster with a matchbox brain. And we've got this lovely alliteration, or in fact consonance of M's, which seems to emphasise the hugeness of this creature. But then the contrast, room-sized monster, with its tiny, he says, brain, matchbox size. If you think that these creatures are 10 metres long, a matchbox is not even 10 centimetres long. So there's a big contrast there. He is implying, in a slightly derogatory fashion, that this creature is not particularly intelligent. And it'll be interesting to compare that with what he says about it later. Moving on to the third stanza, yet another fantastic metaphor. He displaced more than water. Now, if you think of the laws of physics, I'm no scientist, but I know that if you put a large rock in a bucket of water, the surface of the water will rise according to the mass that's been placed in it. And this is what he's saying here. When this large creature moved on the surface of the sea, it wasn't just the water that moved. Something in the poet's mind moved. He had what's called an epiphany. Very useful word here for describing this moment of enlightenment that he suddenly has when he's out in the middle of the sea on his own, facing this huge creature. And then, if you remember, we talked about slounge earlier on as being an interesting word. And here we have shoggled, another beautiful word, which suggests that he was shaken in a significant way. And it moved him back in history, way back, centuries. And then there's another pause here, which shows his reflective tone here. And then he refers to himself in a very negative way, this decadent townie, suggesting that townies, people from the cities, have lost their connection with nature because they pursue a life of pleasure, a hedonistic lifestyle. And the word choice of wrong here suggests that he is beginning to realise that actually humankind are the ones in the wrong. We are related, way back, to this giant sea creature, but we're the ones who are actually the black sheep of the family, if you want. Moving on to the fourth stanza, we've got a lovely onomatopoetic word here, swish. You can almost hear the water, can't you? And if you ever remember as a child taking a stick and swishing up the mud at the bottom of a stream, you can imagine the dirt all swirling around, but gradually it settles down again, and when it does, the water is beautifully clear. And he's suggesting that this shoggling of his mind, once everything has settled down again, lets him suddenly see very clearly humanity's place in this world. And there's a nice short sound here, the repeated I, the assonant I, the idea of the stick jostling back and forward as you swish up the dirt, short and staccato. And then moving on, we have the idea that we all came from slime originally. If we go way back, the slime that became the basking shark stayed in the sea, and the slime that became humans, depending on your view of evolution, slithered out onto the beaches and became humankind. And it makes him think about the paths that we've taken in our evolution since. The basking shark, all it does is eat plankton, doesn't harm anyone. Humans? Well, he asks the question in the next stanza, so who's the monster? And this contrasts strongly with him referring to the basking shark as a monster in stanza 2. He doesn't answer the question, but from what he said, we can probably assume that he's implying humanity. Humans are the monster. And this has a profound effect on him. We've got a long, elongated list of vowels here. The thought made me grow pale slows us right down. And the word choice of pale here at the end of this line emphasises that it's actually had a physical effect on him. This profound realisation of what he and his fellow man, because he is representing mankind here, have done to nature. And suddenly his perspective of the basking shark has changed, because as it goes away from him, he compares it using this lovely metaphor, sail after sail, again elongated vowels, and he's comparing it to a beautiful, elegant sailing ship, very different from the room-sized monster with a matchbox brain, and this contrast serves to accentuate the epiphany that has occurred in his mind. And I love the fact that at the end, as the basking shark departs, we're left with the final words in this poem being the tail as it disappears. It's the end of a very precious experience. The shark has gone. And the fact that it is a very intense experience is perhaps why MacCaig chose to have this as a different form of poem from many of his others, that's very succinct with being short and with the rhyming triplets. That's one thing that you might be able to say about the structure of this poem. It's a beautiful little poem, quite lyrical and very profound. And although many of my students don't actually enjoy it, it has a lot to say about it, even from the imagery alone. So don't overlook it when you're deciding which poems to write about. I hope that's been helpful. See you next time.